You're listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis, the only podcast focused on the biohealth capital region. Each episode, we'll talk to leaders in the industry to break down the biggest topics happening today in biohealth.
Hello, this is Rich Bendis, your host for BioTalk. And today we have a different flavor for this podcast than we normally do. And we know that there's interesting and challenging times that a lot of entrepreneurs, scientists, researchers, small businesses are going through right now based on trying to grow their business, raise money, and do a lot of other things in this sometimes challenging economy that we have. So we thought we would bring a coach on today who works with entrepreneurs and small businesses every day and maybe get some advice for some of our listeners who are going through some of those challenging times right now. So we have Sheetal Ajmani, who's an MD, speaker, a coach, and a consultant with Radiant Living Institute. And I think we'd all like to have a radiant environment these days, Sheetal. So welcome to BioTalk.
Thank you so much for having me, Rich. And I know that this is a little bit of a different flavor, as you mentioned in your intro, a bit of a different flavor in terms of the topic that we're going to be covering today. And it is such an important, such a vital topic. As you mentioned, every founder, entrepreneur, let's just face it, every human goes through challenges in business and in life. And so I really appreciate you welcoming this topic and bringing light to this topic on the show.
Great. One of the best ways to start, though, is in order for people to continue to listen, they want to know more about your background. You could do a better job than I can in introducing yourself. So Sheetal, please introduce yourself to the listeners.
Absolutely. I'm happy to do so. As Rich mentioned, I am Dr. Sheetal Ajmani. I'm a physician. I practiced pediatric medicine for over 16 years. And my interest in the type of work that I'm doing now actually started my first year of medical school over 2 decades ago. Some of those seeds were planted that there is so much more to living a full and whole life than what I was learning in school. Now, of course, what I was learning in medical school was incredibly important and incredibly vital. And I also had this awareness that there were also other aspects of life and healing that contribute to our well-being, to living what feels like for us a very full and vibrant life. And so I actually started my first business about 10 years ago while I was still practicing medicine. And that business was focused primarily on yoga instruction as well as Ayurveda consultants. So tapping into yoga, meditation, mindfulness, these Eastern mind-body practices, as well as Ayurveda, which is the ancient medical system of India. So I've studied both Eastern and Western medical systems. And about 3 years ago, I made the decision to leave clinical practice from pediatric care to founding my current company, Radiant Living Institute, where I now work full-time. I'm the founder, speaker, coach, and consultant. And in this current role, I partner with high-achieving individuals to help them manage stress, cultivate confidence, and foster resilience through personal and professional challenges. And my approach is a very unique one that brings together modern evidence-based science, psychology, neuroscience, as well as some of these Eastern traditions that have existed for over thousands of years. And I really bring all of that together in my approach in my speaking and coaching work. And specifically, this work has led me to support founders, leaders, and executives through pivotal transition points in their businesses, careers, and their lives.
Thank you for that background. And what I'm interested in is you've had a doctor of pediatric medicine, and now you're working with adults, but a lot of them probably perform like adolescents. So maybe it's not as big a conversion as it normally is. But what made you decide to go from working in the pediatric world to the adult world that you're in today?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So although my specialty was in pediatrics, I primarily communicated and counseled adults, their parents. And so that's what I spent a good portion of my time doing in counseling and guiding parents on the best ways to care for their children through complex medical conditions and critical issues that they were navigating. And made this comment that many adults, we may often have these sort of adolescent tendencies as well. And that goes back to just the evolution of human nature and our brains. I hope to talk a little bit in today's topic of that sort of evolutionary parts of our mind because that so greatly plays into our stress response as well. And that is all across the board for every human being everywhere. And so that's a little bit of my transition from pediatrics to working with adults. The other part of that has been my own personal journey, though. I shared my background earlier of my professional exploration of Western medicine and science, as well as Eastern medical traditions and philosophies. And there's also a personal exploration of that as well. So throughout my own journey with navigating multiple bouts of career burnout, through navigating multiple challenges in my personal life, I have leaned into a lot of the tools and the approaches that I have since developed and combined and translated that I now guide my clients through as well.
So you are a founder and an entrepreneur yourself. Basically, self-analysis sometimes work, right?
Yeah.
But it's hard. Sometimes the doctor doesn't go to the doctor when they need help. So as a founder and an entrepreneur in your own business, do you recognize when you need to take a step back and reflect?
Yeah, that's true. And again, this does go back to some of my own experiences. As you mentioned, often as physicians, we are the last to seek help ourselves. And I've noticed this across not only physicians, but across many high achieving individuals who work in high stakes environments. And that's why I believe this conversation is very useful to all founders and specifically to your listeners in the biohealth industry as well. Because generally, as high achieving individuals, it can be hard for anyone to ask for help. And what I've found in my work is that particularly for high achieving individuals who may tend to hold ourselves to unreasonably high standards of things like perfectionism and people pleasing, it can feel even more challenging to reach out and seek support. So it was my own journey of reaching those depths of low points where I felt like I had no option but to ask for help. And after reaching those points enough times, you start to realize, hey, maybe I should ask for help sooner. Maybe I should start to recognize these signs of exhaustion or these signs of stress or these signs of burnout or these signs that my body is sending me as signals that can show up differently for different people, that can show up as not sleeping well. It can show up as feeling anxious. It can show up as pain. This is another interesting aspect of what drew me to this work is that as a physician, one thing that I noticed and I came to realize is that so often in medical practice, we focus primarily on the physical body, on healing the physical body and addressing symptoms within the physical body, unless you work in psychiatry or psychology. And that will focus more on the mind and emotions. And yet what I've come to realize is that our mental and emotional state directly impacts our physical body as well. Physical symptoms will appear when we are under stress or when we are living in a state that is not aligned with our inherent strengths and capabilities and even our quote unquote imperfections and weaknesses. So what I do in my coaching work is I really help people align their external pursuits with their inner nature. And that includes their working style, which is important because that is something that as founders, we do have within the development of our businesses, navigating a working style that feels aligned for you to help mitigate some of the development of burnout. We're all going to experience stress, but can we mitigate that so that it doesn't lead to that level of burnout where it is impacting ourselves, our colleagues, the company, investors, and on?
Yeah. So basically, if I'm an investor, a board member, a partner with a founder, what are the signs or early warning signals that there are that when I'm interacting with them that said, hey, maybe there is some stress. Maybe there's some signs here where there needs to be a step back or there needs to be some intervention with that founder. So talk a little bit about what some of those early warning signals are that for us as external observers or close partners with founders that we should be looking for.
That's a great question. The external signs will most likely come first in changes of temperament. So you may notice that the founder seems to be a bit more irritable, a bit more short or snappy in their responses. maybe a bit more increasingly reactive. They might become defensive easily or quick to micromanage. So noticing some changes in the founder's temperament will be some of the early external signals. Now, it's important to note, and I want to really emphasize this though, that when it reaches the point that it is starting to be observable to others, so being observable to advisors or mentors or investors, most likely it has already been brewing in the founder for quite some time. Again, as high achieving individuals who are used to working in high stakes environment, there can be this tendency to want to initially try to work through it all on their own. They may try to establish a sense of control around the development of this stress or exhaustion or burnout that may be developing. And so before it shows up to external partners, it will have likely been already brewing for quite a while. And I think that's important to recognize. And I also I alluded to it a little bit earlier. I wanted to talk a little bit about some definitions of stress and burnout. And I go over these definitions in a lot of my keynote talks as well. But I think it will be helpful for those who are working with founders, so advisors, investors, board members, as well as the founders themselves, so that they can begin to perhaps recognize this within themselves or others as well. And so I like to talk about the difference between stress and burnout. I mentioned earlier that we all experience some degree of stress in our life, and stress is not all bad. We actually need some degree of stress in our life. Psychology shows there's something called the Yerkes-Dodson law that stress up until a certain point actually drives performance and productivity. So it's actually helpful. When it exceeds that certain point, it no longer becomes helpful. That type of stress that is actually helpful for us, that drives performance, that drives productivity, that's called eustress. And we talk about this in medicine as well. The physical body actually needs some degree of stress on it. Think about lifting weights. You're intentionally putting some stress onto your muscles, and then you also balance that out with some recovery. But some degree of stress is actually important and is actually helpful to us. And that type of stress is called eustress, eustress. When it exceeds that threshold of being helpful to us, that is known as distress. And if it continues beyond that, if you are continuously exposed to stressful triggers over a prolonged period of time, that can lead to burnout. So stress itself is something that is experienced in limited period of time. It is associated with physiological changes in the body. Heart rate increases, breath becomes quicker and more shallow, blood pressure increases. And when that stressful trigger is removed, that physiological response returns to baseline as well. Your heart rate slows down, your respiratory rate slows down. But if that is not removed, it can then lead to burnout. And so burnout, the literature describes three key definitions, three key characteristics of burnout. One is overwhelming exhaustion. So mental, emotional, physical exhaustion. Two is feelings of cynicism and detachment from the job. And then three is a sense of ineffectiveness and lack of accomplishment. So going back to your original question here, how can advisors, mentors, board members recognize this? So I mentioned, first of all, changes in temperament. Second, looking at this definition of burnout, overwhelming exhaustion, mental, emotional, physical, that's going to impact decision-making. Feelings of cynicism and detachment from the work, you may start to pick up on a lack of or a decrease in personal investment in the work that they're creating in the company. A sense of ineffectiveness and lack of accomplishment, you might notice this starting to creep up as self-doubt or analysis paralysis of focusing so much on a certain decision because there's this nagging feeling of self-doubt or sense of ineffectiveness that's creeping in, that's keeping them from making decisions that you may have observed in the past that they would have been able to make quite readily.
So with all of these signals that you're talking about, Sheetal, I think being an entrepreneur myself and a founder, just like you have been, sometimes this self-recognition is very tough because for a founder, an entrepreneur, it can be embarrassing to actually accept that there's stress, there's frustration, there's burnout. The other thing is CEOs of emerging companies basically don't have a lot of people to talk to. And sometimes it's very difficult to have interactions with some of those external advisors or board members or investors because, as we say, you don't want to also acknowledge that there's a challenge or a problem there because that causes concern other than internal, it's external concern. I used to have an investor when I was running a company many decades ago. He would call me every Friday night and say, Rich, what are you losing sleep over? He didn't want to know what was the best thing that was happening for me that week or what was the greatest accomplishment we had. It is, where can I help? And where are you encountering challenges? So the question becomes for you is, once there's an acknowledgement, whether it's either the self-acknowledgement of the entrepreneur or it's from an external partner or relation to that founder, what is the intervention? How do you determine what help is needed? Where do you go to get the help? Because this isn't something that's really accepted. I don't know of a lot of founders that have this, that say basically, hey, I need help, and where do I go? I don't know of anybody that's ever said this to me, Sheetal. I've noticed that they need help, but from your perspective, you've got a unique niche practice in what you do. So what are the next steps, either from that internal or that external realization that help is needed?
That's such a great question. And I love this perspective that you've shared. And you're right, that is what holds so many of us back. And I shared my own experience that for a while I did as well. And even when you have that self-awareness, I mean, I can share an example of even just a few years ago where while I was practicing clinical medicine, I experienced another bout of burnout. But at that point, already been studying, already been aware of these tools and had experienced burnout in my past. And it still felt difficult for me to ask for help. So even having that self-awareness, it can still feel difficult. However, one thing that I have noticed both for myself as well as clients I've worked with and groups that I've spoken with is that when we open up to one another, we realize that we're not alone at all. We connect to one another through a common shared humanity. And that is powerful. I have an engagement that I'm very proud of, and that would be perhaps relevant and interesting to some of your listeners is I delivered a keynote a couple years ago at the Women Building Bio conference, which is hosted by Virginia Bio. And that topic was about self-care. How do we practice self-care with limited time when we're working in high stakes situations? And as part of all of my keynotes, I do some small group sessions. Now, this was a room of over 100 people. When I introduce that we're going to do some small group discussion around this topic, a topic that can feel vulnerable, this is across the board, the rooms usually get a little bit silent. And then I introduce it as a safe space. And I do what I can to ensure that it's a safe space. And I go over a few guidelines. And what I'm getting at here is that once they get started sharing in the small groups, they don't want to stop. I always, with every engagement that I do, I have the hardest time calling people back to join into the larger group again. Because once they get started, resoundingly, people tell me, I thought I was the only one who was feeling this way. I thought I was the only one going through this. And I realized that I'm not. So that is one of the reasons that I'm so grateful, Rich, that you invited me to the show. And that is one of my intentions in the work that I do now is to help people realize that you really are not alone and to be able to open up spaces for these genuine, vulnerable conversations. And again, going back to, I'm going to repeat this phrase, to coming together within our shared humanity. Because saying that you're having a hard time or saying that you're experiencing challenges, that doesn't make you any less than. It just acknowledges your humanity. And so then what you mentioned also of whether you recognize this through self-awareness or through an external awareness, I want to touch on that a little bit before I get to that question, because you brought up a really important point that it can be hard even to recognize that within yourself. And one of the big pieces in the work that I do with clients is starting to recognize your own body's signals. So your body will send you signals when you are crossing that threshold of healthy stress to distress and then eventually burnout. And I referenced earlier a few different ways that can show up in your body. And I've had on my own podcast, Essential Self-Care, I've had over 60 guests, 100 episodes. And my guests resoundingly share that For a while, they ignored their own body signals. But once those signals got loud enough, they started to pay attention. And that's when they realized they needed to make a change. And that's very natural for many of us. We'll keep pushing through. As an example, let's say you have a mild headache. You may keep pushing through that mild headache, but then your body will send you louder signals until you're ready to pay attention to it. For anyone who's listening right now, who's wondering, well, how do I detect how I'm feeling? How do I detect where I am in terms of this stress, eustress, distress, or burnout? Start paying attention to your body's signals. Take moments in your day to pause, and they do not have to be long pauses. I realize we are all busy individuals. We live in a very fast-paced world, but take moments to pause. When I work with clients, even just a few seconds or a minute a day to just pause, whether that's sitting while you're sipping on some tea or coffee in the morning or in the afternoon and just looking out the window, just for a few seconds, 30 seconds, a minute a day, just pause and notice how your body feels. Do you feel tense in your shoulders? Do you feel relaxed? How is your breath? So that's a way to start noticing it yourself and to start cultivating that self-awareness. And then with regards to external, I love the story that you shared, Rich, of the mentor who would call you every Friday. You had this, it was like an appointment, it sounds like, every Friday, and they would ask you, what are you losing sleep over? So that's another great way to cultivate some of that awareness through engaging a partner, whether that is a colleague, a friend, or a family member, and saying, hey, can we just set up this time once a week or once every 2 weeks where we just send each other a quick text or a quick phone call or go for a walk or grab a cup of coffee and just check in. So I think that's wonderful. Now, Rich, I know I've been rambling on, but now to get to the question that you mentioned, of the actual question that you had, which was, what can you do as an intervention? So first of all, if you are experiencing depression, anxiety, if you're experiencing any thoughts of harming yourself or anyone else, then of course, please seek professional help. Know that you are not alone. Know that it is not a weakness. It is actually a sign of strength to seek professional help. So seek the assistance of your physician or a mental health provider. If you are noticing that you are starting to feel stressed, perhaps starting to feel burnout, some other things that you can do. One I mentioned about pausing, which is, I had mentioned it in reference of taking a few seconds or a minute each day to pause and check in with yourself. You might need a little bit of a longer pause, and that's fine. Maybe you give yourself a morning off or an hour a week or a weekend. So give yourself a pause. And I want to reframe this pause because I know as entrepreneurs, as founders, it can be hard. It can feel very difficult to pause for many reasons. There may be external pressures, certainly with scaling your business, investors, with your board, et cetera, right? There may be these external pressures that make it feel very difficult to pause. There may be a lot of these internal factors that make it very difficult to pause as well. You may be building out a project that started as a passion project and you have a vision for it. And so it may be difficult to pause even simply because there's a part of you that just really enjoys working on it, that you feel like you can work on it 24/7. But when you notice those signs in your body, giving yourself that opportunity to pause and reframing it as not a setback or failure. And I think this is important for the founders as well as the advisors and mentors and investors, that it's not a setback or failure, but it's actually a part of the journey. It's a necessary part of the journey. And then set boundaries. I think that's an important one as well in terms of something that you can do to address it. Most often when I am working with clients, what they realize is that the person they need to set boundaries with is themselves. And so I'll share a quick example of a founder I was working with. She felt like she had to reply to every message day or night within 20 minutes or less. Whether that came through by text or on social media or by email, day or evening, she felt like she needed to respond to it within 20 minutes or less. And she realized that no one else actually expected that of her, but it was a pressure that she had put on herself. And it was leading her to feel burnt out, exhausted. It was impacting her relationship with her husband, who felt like she was distracted when they were trying to have quality time together. And so she decided that she needed to set a boundary with herself to turn off her phone notifications in the evenings. And so that's a boundary to set with oneself, taking a moment to examine the pressures that we're putting on ourselves and where that's coming from.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that it's hard to have boundaries because as a founder and entrepreneur, basically you're on 24/7. It's hard to turn it off. I know even at my young age, I still have that challenge right now. But there's another dimension here that I think we should talk about, Sheetal. And as a consultant and a coach, sometimes you might become aware of another situation with a founder, and that is sometimes founders start companies, but they probably might not be the person to lead the companies when they get into a major growth mode. And they're referred to sometimes as threshold companies, where entrepreneurial management can take them so far, but then professional management has to step in beyond where the founder can take it. And I went to a class for a week 1 year, and it was basically talking about you're only as strong as far as your shadow will reach. And that means that you as a founder can only do so much by yourself unless you have all of the other resources you need around you to support you, or else that stress is just going to continue to grow. So, as the consultant and the coach, in addition to helping them themselves, how about the realization that maybe they've taken this company as far as they can go? And it's also challenging for them to accept that they've gotten to a level where they can't take it any further without additional help. Is that something that you've run into with your coaching and counseling? And then how do you broach that intervention that needs to happen there? And that really is board members and investors and everybody else really need to become involved when there might need to be a founder transition or a founder change. So a little bit of experience you've had in that area.
Yeah, absolutely. That's such an important question as well. I have spoken with founders who have talked to me about with so much focus on scaling their business and growth and rapid growth. And they've found that their business has experienced rapid growth. And they've come to me and they said, we're here. This is exactly what we wanted. But realizing that they weren't prepared for the physical, mental, emotional capacity that would require and demands that would require. So the growth came at a faster rate than what they had that capacity for. And they said to me, no one ever told me about this. And so I want to bring that up because you can experience all of these things that we've been talking about here today, Rich, the stress, the exhaustion, the burnout. You can experience all of that during the obstacles, during the challenges on the road of entrepreneurship, during the setbacks, but you can also experience it during those periods of rapid growth, as you mentioned, and where that rapid growth may also lead to some other transition points that are necessary. So you can experience it on both sides of that, from those quote unquote setbacks or obstacles or what one may view as sort of negative challenges, but you can also experience that with those positive challenges associated with rapid growth. And so in terms of seeking that support, coming to that realization for whether there may be full founder transition or seeking additional support and resources to support the founder, it really goes back to self-awareness and to helping encourage and cultivate that self-awareness in that leader, in that founder. And that can be hard. When I work with leaders, one of the hardest things to do, especially for new leaders, is delegation. Delegate to their team, and particularly for founders who are working 24/7, day and night, invest so much of a personal investment as well into building and growing their companies. That can be a difficult transition. And so it does start with that self-awareness and recognizing, and what I often will work with clients and sort of drafting out and actually writing out and making a chart of like, what are the things that energize them in the work that they're doing? What are the things that it's really important that they stay involved in? What are the things that they would be able to delegate either because they necessarily don't need to be the person doing that, or that doesn't energize them, that leaves them depleted. So that would be best in someone else's hands. And so I really walk through in my work with my clients in outlining all of that for them. So it really is individual dependent in terms of specifically what that looks like, but it really starts with that self-awareness.
Right. And you keep talking about the clients that you're working with. So I would assume a client identifies a need and then comes to you and say, can you help me? I would imagine. What's a traditional engagement look like with a client for you? How do you set the parameters for what the engagement looks like? Long does an engagement traditionally, even though everyone's different, how long was it traditionally last? And other than working with the founder themselves, have you ever worked with a venture capital firm or an investor group who said, I think we could use your help with one of our portfolio founders? That's another side of this, other than the founder recognition themselves. So maybe you can elaborate on both of those areas.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have worked with individual clients who have come to me directly. I've also worked with organizations who have recognized the value of coaching for their leaders. And so who have brought in or invited me to work with a few of their leaders on their team for engagements, typically ranging from about 6 months to 1 year. And we start off every engagement, I start off with every engagement with setting goals together with the client and really understanding what's most important to them, where they want to make forward movement and progress. And so we work together in setting goals together. And then each session, each engagement, we are working towards those goals. And so coaching engagements look like sessions that can vary in frequency and duration, again, mutually determined. Typically, an hour session twice a month is rather typical for 6 months to a year. And it can look like a lot of ways. I have some clients who like to have homework and action items in between sessions. So we'll workshop ideas together, we'll workshop solutions together. It's all very customized and very individual. One thing that I am a big proponent of and truly believe is that we are all individual and we're all unique. And so we all need to have completely customized plans to move forward. And so we work together in that way, problem solving, workshopping through these engagements.
This is really interesting, and I'm sure we could go on for a long time talking about this, Sheetal, and I'm sure we'll have a follow-up. But what might be interesting in the future is if we could take someone that has experienced your coaching and mentoring, bring them on the show, because there'd be nothing better for other founders or entrepreneurs to hear someone who's actually experienced this and come out the other end feeling stronger about themselves and their capabilities as a founder. So I think that's something that we could look to do potentially in the future. Is there anything that we didn't go over in this first edition that you'd like to leave with the listeners? And especially if people want to learn more information about how to reach Dr. Sheetal Ajmani, how do they get in touch with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So big takeaways I would want listeners to leave with is that if you are experiencing any challenges that are showing up in your life in these forms that we talked about today, know that you are not alone. And know that you're not meant to go through anything alone. As human beings, we are social creatures and we are meant to go through life together and to support one another. Coming back to a phrase that I said earlier, speaking about it, talking about it, bringing it up, while that can feel rather difficult, it is actually connecting over our shared humanity. It does not mean that there's anything wrong with you. It simply means that you are human. In terms of where people can find me and learn more about me, I am at radiantlivinginstitute.com. I also have a free guide available on my website. So if you are looking for a place to start with concrete, tangible next steps, it is called the Radiant Living Starter Guide. There's a link to it on my homepage. It's a free download. It's a free workbook. And it takes about 20 to 30 minutes to go through that workbook. It goes through 6 steps, which is part of my core coaching curriculum. And so you'll get a preview of that, and you'll also come away with clear action items just simply through going through that workbook. So that's available. And then you can also tune into my podcast, which is called Essential Self-Care, and that's on all podcast platforms.
Well, one thing we're going to do for you, Sheetal, is when this podcast goes live, probably next week sometime, we'll also do a transcription. And in that transcription of the podcast, we can list your website and your podcast and how people connect with you. So I want to thank you for coming on BioTalk. I know this won't be the last time that we engage with one another, but thank you for all the help you do for all the founders and entrepreneurs out there. We need a strong ecosystem. And we know that there are some challenging times right now, but we want to help as many people as we can get through them so they can be successful founders and business people in the future. So thank you for being on BioTalk.
Thank you, Rich.
Thanks for listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis.